Victor Hale did not look at the child when he walked past her. That was the part Caleb Hunter could not forget. Not the way the man's boots barely slowed, not the expensive coat brushing the air beside her. It was the eyes, the deliberate, practiced emptiness of a man who had decided, somewhere in the cold machinery of his mind, that a 7-year-old girl sitting alone on rotting steps in the middle of January simply did not exist. Lily Monroe had been sitting on those steps for 15 days. 15 days of frost and wind, and strangers stepping around her like she was a loose board they didn't want to trip over. 15 days of the town of Blackridge Valley going about its business. The feed store opening, the saloon filling up at dusk, horses clopping past on frozen mud, while a child with hollow cheeks and her father's coat wrapped twice around her small body waited for someone who was never coming back. And nobody stopped. Not the preacher who passed every morning, not the women who ran the dry goods store and surely saw her from the window, not the sheriff, who Caleb would later learn had been paid to look the other way so thoroughly that looking the other way had become the man's primary occupation. If you've ever stood in a crowd and felt completely invisible, if you've ever been the person that everyone chose not to see, then you already understand something about Lily Monroe that most of Blackridge Valley never did. This is the story of a cowboy who had nothing left and a little girl who had even less. And what happened when one of them finally decided that walking away was no longer something he was willing to do. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, something about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the world goes quiet and cruel, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week we bring you stories that don't let go. And drop a comment right now telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Blackridge Valley, back to those steps, back to the moment everything changed. The morning Caleb Hunter first noticed Lily Monroe, he almost didn't stop either. That was the honest truth of it. And Caleb was a man who, when pressed, would eventually arrive at honest truths, even if the road getting there was longer than it should have been. He had ridden into Blackridge Valley 3 days earlier with $42, a horse that was starting to favor her left front leg, and no particular plan beyond finding work and staying out of trouble. He had been doing that, avoiding trouble, avoiding attachment, avoiding anything that required him to care too much, for going on 4 years. He was good at it by then. He had the hollowed-out look of a man who had learned how to move through the world without leaving a mark on it. He was walking from the livery toward the only restaurant in town that wasn't also a saloon when he saw her. She was small, smaller than he expected, given how long he'd later learned she'd been sitting there. Children who haven't eaten properly have a way of shrinking into themselves, and Lily had pulled every inch of her body inward, knees to chest, arms wrapped around her knees. Her father's coat, a man's coat, brown canvas with a cracked collar, swallowing her almost completely. Only her face was visible above the collar, and her eyes, which were brown and direct and exhausted, in the way that only very old people and very young children who have seen too much ever look exhausted. Caleb slowed. He told himself later it was just because the steps were in his path. The trading post had been abandoned for years. He'd gathered that much from his few days in town, and the steps jutting out from its front door were slightly in the way of the most natural walking line. He slowed because of the steps, not because of the girl. He almost believed himself. But then she looked up at him, and he stopped completely. Not because she asked him to. She didn't ask him for anything. She didn't hold out her hand or say a word or do any of the things a child begging for help might do. She just looked at him with those exhausted brown eyes. And there was something in the look, not pleading, not hopeful, not even particularly frightened, that hit him somewhere behind his sternum and didn't let go. It was the look of someone who had already accepted that the answer was going to be no and was just waiting for him to confirm it by walking away. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He hadn't been talking much lately. She didn't answer. "You waiting for somebody?" A pause. Then, carefully, "My papa. He coming soon?" Something moved through her face, quick and complicated, and then settled back into that careful stillness. "He told me to wait here." Caleb looked up and down the street. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of January cold that gets into your bones and sets up a residence, and he was wearing a decent coat and still feeling it. She had that canvas thing with the cracked collar. How long you been waiting? She thought about it seriously, like it was a question that deserved real consideration. A while. He'd learn later that she knew exactly how long. She'd been counting the days by the notches she'd made in the back of the bottom step with a nail she'd found in the mud. 15 notches. She knew. She just wasn't ready to say the number out loud to a stranger, because saying it out loud to a stranger would make it real in a way it hadn't been yet. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out half a biscuit wrapped in a handkerchief. He'd been saving it from breakfast because he wasn't sure what his money situation was going to look like by dinner. He held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him, then at it again. "I'm not supposed to take things from strangers," she said. "That's a good rule," Caleb said. "My papa taught me that." "Your papa sounds like a smart man." He kept his hand where it was. She kept looking at the biscuit. A full minute might have passed, maybe longer. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed, and boots scraped on frozen ground, and the sounds of a town going about its morning continued without any awareness of what was happening on these particular steps. Lily Monroe reached out and took the biscuit. She ate it in small, careful bites, like someone who had learned not to eat too fast, which was its own kind of painful observation. She didn't thank him. She didn't make conversation. When she was done, she folded the handkerchief neatly and held it back out to him. He took it. He stood there another moment, not entirely sure what he was doing or why he hadn't walked away yet. "You got anywhere to go tonight?" he asked. "When it gets dark?" "I have to wait here," she said. "Papa said wait here." "Right." He nodded slowly. "Okay." He walked away. He got almost to the end of the block before he stopped again. He stood there with his back to her for a long moment, staring at the frozen ground, having a conversation with himself that he would later describe, when describing it was required, as the worst argument he'd ever lost. He had places to be. He had his own problems. He had a horse with a bad leg, and $42 and a rule, a very practical rule he'd developed over 4 years of living by it, that said, don't get involved in things that are going to get complicated. This was going to get complicated. He could feel it already, the way you can sometimes feel weather coming before there's a single cloud in the sky. He went back. Lily Monroe did not look surprised to see him return. That was almost the hardest part. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily," she said. "Lily Monroe." "Caleb Hunter." He crouched down to her level, which put him at eye contact distance, which was uncomfortable in a way that felt important. "Lily, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, okay? Not what you think I want to hear, the truth." She studied him with those old eyes. "Okay. Has anybody brought you food since you've been waiting here?" A pause. "Mrs. Greer left a roll on the step 2 days ago. She didn't stop. She just put it there and kept walking." "Anybody else?" "No." He exhaled through his nose. "And water?" "There's a trough over there." She gestured toward the horse trough on the other side of the street. "I wait until nobody's looking." Something moved through Caleb's chest that he didn't have a clean name for. Fury was part of it. Sorrow was part of it. And under both of those, something older and more personal that he'd been trying not to look at directly for 4 years. He stood up. He looked around at the town of Blackridge Valley, at the storefronts and the smoke coming from chimneys and the ordinary life of a place going about its business. And he thought quietly to himself, "What is wrong with you people? Here's what's going to happen," he said. He kept his voice level because she didn't need his anger right now. She needed something reliable. "I'm going to go find out what I can find out about your papa, and you're going to tell me his name and anything else you think might help. And tonight, if he hasn't come back by dark, you're going to come with me somewhere warm. Not forever, just for tonight. You can come back in the morning." Lily Monroe looked at him for a long time. "His name is Samuel Monroe," she said finally. "He worked at the Dunbar Ranch. He said—" She paused. Her hands tightened in her lap. "He said if anything happened to him, I should wait here and show the papers to someone who seemed honest." "What papers?" She opened her coat. Under the canvas, pressed flat against her chest inside what he'd thought was just her shirt, there was something else. A leather pouch, the kind with a drawstring top, worn smooth with handling. She pulled it out carefully, the way you'd carry something fragile, and held it against her front without opening it. "Papa said these are worth more than anything in this valley," she said. He said not to let anyone take them. He said the wrong person gets these. Her voice went quiet. He said, everything's lost. Caleb looked at the leather pouch. He looked at the girl holding it. And he understood, in the way you sometimes understand things before you have the information to prove them, that Samuel Monroe had not just abandoned his daughter on these steps. Samuel Monroe had placed his daughter here, with those papers, with specific instructions, because Samuel Monroe was either already dead or very close to it. And whatever was in that pouch was why. He also understood something else, something that clicked into place with a coldness that had nothing to do with the January air. The town that had walked past this child for 15 days wasn't just indifferent. Some of them, maybe most of them, knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was carrying and exactly why it was safer to keep walking than to stop. Okay, Caleb said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Okay, Lily, don't open that yet. Don't show it to anybody else. You hear me? She nodded. I'll be back in 2 hours. If I'm not back in 2 hours? He thought about this. You go inside the restaurant on the corner and you tell them you're waiting for Caleb Hunter, and he said to give you something to eat. I'll settle up with them. He reached into his pocket and put 2 coins on the step beside her. Not so many that anyone watching would notice, just enough. 2 hours, he said. He went to find out what happened to Samuel Monroe. It took him 45 minutes. He didn't find out everything. He wouldn't find out everything for days yet, but he found out enough. The man at the feed store had worked with Samuel Monroe briefly, 2 seasons back, and he talked about him the way people talk about the dead even when they won't use the word dead. Past tense. Careful pauses. Eyes that didn't quite meet Caleb's. Samuel Monroe had been a ranch hand at the Dunbar property until about 8 months ago, when Elias Dunbar had sold his operation and moved on. Monroe had stayed on the land because, and here the feed store man got quieter, checking the door without quite meaning to, because Monroe claimed the land, or at least a part of it. He said his family had rights to the section near the spring. He had papers, the man said, legal ones. Victor Hale wanted that land, the feed store man said. His voice had dropped to something barely above conversation level. Wanted it bad. Something about the water rights. That spring feeds half the ranches in the eastern part of the valley. And Monroe, Caleb said. The feed store man started straightening things that didn't need straightening. Found at the bottom of the canyon back of the Dunbar property, 6 weeks ago, give or take. They said his horse spooked, fell. They, Caleb said. Who's they? More straightening. The sheriff. Victor Hale's men found him. A pause. Victor Hale was real quick to offer condolences to anyone who'd listen. Caleb walked back to the trading post steps in the kind of focused, deliberate quiet that his father had once called the stillness before the decision. He'd been a hard man, his father, and not always a good one, but he'd known something about what it looked like when a person was about to do something that couldn't be undone. Lily was where he'd left her. She'd tucked the leather pouch back under her coat, and she was sitting in exactly the same position, watching the street the same way, except now she was watching for him specifically. He could tell by the way she tracked him as soon as he turned the corner. I need you to tell me everything, he said, sitting down on the step beside her. Not above her. Beside her. Everything your papa told you, everything you know. She looked at him steadily. Did you find out something bad? He thought about lying. He thought about it for a second. Then he looked at those exhausted brown eyes, those eyes that had already made peace with bad news in a way no child should have to, and he said, yes. She nodded slowly, like she'd known, like maybe she'd known for all 15 days. His accident, she said. It wasn't an accident, was it? It wasn't a question. I don't know for certain, Caleb said, but I don't think it was. She was quiet for a moment, her hands pressed flat against the leather pouch beneath her coat. Then she said, Papa told me a man named Victor Hale was trying to take our land. He said if something happened to him, the papers prove the land belongs to us. He said there's a deed, and there's something else. He called it a prior claim. He said if anyone could read the papers and understand them, the law would have to give the land back. Who did he say to show them to? Someone with the badge, she said. But not the sheriff here. He said the sheriff here does what Mr. Hale says. He said I'd have to wait for someone with a federal badge or a lawyer from outside the valley. Caleb sat back slightly. He thought about what she'd just said, about the specificity of it, the planning of it. A man arranging his own affairs, leaving instructions for his daughter, choosing the abandoned trading post deliberately because it was visible in public and because a man with something to hide couldn't grab a child off busy public steps without anyone noticing, even in a town full of people looking the other way. Samuel Monroe had been more careful than the end result suggested, more careful and more afraid. He really did think something might happen to him, Caleb said, not quite meaning to say it out loud. He didn't want to leave me, Lily said, with a fierceness that was sudden and complete and slightly startling. He didn't abandon me. I need you to know that. He set this up because he had to, because he didn't have a choice. I know, Caleb said. People look at me like he just left, she said, and the fierceness had something shaking behind it now, something that she was containing with visible effort. I can see it, the way they look, like I'm something nobody wanted. That's not what I see, Caleb said. She looked at him sharply, waiting for the lie. I see a kid who's been doing exactly what her father asked her to do for 15 days in the cold, he said. I see somebody who hasn't given up even when giving up would have been the easier thing. He held her gaze. Your papa knew what he was doing when he set this up. He knew you'd hold. Something happened in her face then. Not quite crying, she was too careful for that, too practiced at holding herself in, but something loosened just slightly behind the eyes. So what do we do? She asked. And that was the moment. Not the biscuit, not the going back, but that was when Caleb Hunter made the choice that changed the next several months of his life. Because she said we. Not what do I do or what should I do or even what do you think. She said we, and she said it like she'd already decided something about him, and he found that he didn't want to disappoint whatever it was she'd decided. First, he said, we get you somewhere warmer than these steps. Then we talk about what's in those papers and what it's going to take to make sure the right people see them. And if Mr. Hale tries to stop us? Caleb looked down the street in the direction of the largest, most solid-looking building in town. The Hale Land and Cattle Company, the sign read, though in Black Ridge Valley it might as well have said, Victor Hale owns what he looks at. It sat at the end of Main Street like a period at the end of a sentence. Then we deal with that when it comes, he said. He said it more confidently than he felt, which was probably the most important thing he could have done, because Lily Monroe had been sitting on those steps for 15 days watching people decide she wasn't worth the trouble. And what she needed right now, more than warmth, more than food, more than legal strategy, was to see someone look at what was coming and not flinch. He stood up. He held out his hand. She took it. They were halfway down the block when a voice behind them said, Hunter. He stopped. He turned around. The man standing in the middle of the street was one he hadn't seen before, but he understood immediately what the man was. The particular stillness, the way his coat sat on his shoulders, the quality of attention in his eyes that had nothing to do with curiosity. He was a hired man, hired for specific purposes that didn't include conversation. Mr. Hale would like to meet you, the man said pleasantly. He says he'd like to help you understand the situation with the girl. Caleb felt Lily's hand tighten in his. He looked at the man. He looked at the direction of the Hale Land and Cattle Company. He thought about $42 and a horse with a bad leg and a rule about not getting involved in complicated things. Tell Mr. Hale, he said, that I appreciate the invitation. He paused just long enough. I'll keep it in mind. He turned around and kept walking. He did not look back, but he heard the man standing in the street behind them, heard him not moving, heard the weight of someone watching them go. And he understood with absolute clarity that whatever had just started, whatever it was that had begun on those steps with a biscuit in a leather pouch, and a girl with her father's eyes, it had just gotten the attention of the most powerful man in Black Ridge Valley. The rule about not getting involved in complicated things was officially retired. He'd made his choice. Now he was going to have to live inside it. The question that would keep him awake for many nights to come, was whether living inside it would mean something different for Lily Monroe by the end. Whether a man with nothing left to lose could be worth enough to a child who had already lost everything. He didn't have an answer yet, but he kept walking, and she kept her hand in his, and the frozen mud of Black Ridge Valley crunched under their boots, and somewhere behind them a hired man stood in the street and watched them go. Inside Lily's coat, pressed flat against her chest, the leather pouch held its secrets. And somewhere in the valley, in the land office, in the courthouse, in the careful account books of a man who had built an empire by deciding other people's things belonged to him, Victor Hale was about to be told that someone had finally picked up the child he'd been waiting for to simply disappear. He would not take the news well. He never did, when someone chose not to disappear. Caleb Hunter had spent 4 years making himself invisible, making himself nothing, making himself into a man so empty of attachment that the world could roll right over him without catching. He thought that was survival. He thought that was what you did after you lost everything that mattered. He was starting to understand that he'd been wrong. Surviving and being alive were not, it turned out, the same thing. And whatever was pressed against this child's chest inside that worn leather pouch, whatever document her dead father had died protecting, it had just done something that 4 years of wandering hadn't managed. It had given Caleb Hunter something to lose again. He wasn't sure yet if that was terrifying or if it was, in some rough, reluctant, inconvenient way, the closest thing to relief he'd felt in years. Maybe both. Maybe, when it came to things worth protecting, it had always been both. They reached the edge of town before either of them spoke again. Caleb had taken them off Main Street and down a side path that ran behind the tannery, not because he had a clear destination in mind, but because he needed to not be visible. And visibility on Main Street right now felt like a particular kind of stupid. The hired man had stopped following them, or at least had stopped following them in any way Caleb could detect. But that didn't mean nobody was watching. In a town like Black Ridge Valley, the watching happened in layers. There were the people paid to watch, and then there were the people who watched for free because information was its own currency, and Victor Hale was known to be generous with people who kept him informed. Lily walked beside him without complaint, matching his pace even though her legs were shorter and she had to work slightly harder to do it. She didn't ask where they were going. He noticed that. Most children would have asked. She just walked, one hand in his, the other pressed flat against her coat over the leather pouch. The ranch he had in mind belonged to a woman named Clara Briggs. He'd heard her name his first day in town, in the context of someone the feed store man had mentioned in the same breath as the words. Doesn't take any nonsense and hasn't sold to Hale yet. God knows he's tried. He'd filed that away the way he filed away most things that seemed potentially useful, without knowing why or when the usefulness would arrive. He was hoping it had arrived now. Clara Briggs' place was 1.5 miles outside town on the North Road, a modest operation by valley standards, 24 head of cattle, a kitchen garden, a barn that had seen better decades. The house itself was small and square and had the look of a place that had been repaired many times in many places without ever being replaced, which Caleb found more trustworthy than something new. He knocked. The woman who opened the door was somewhere in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back and hands that had the permanent rough look of someone who'd done outdoor work for 40 years. She took in Caleb, then Lily, then Caleb again. "I don't know you," she said. "No, ma'am. My name's Caleb Hunter. I've been in town 3 days." "I can tell." Her eyes moved to Lily. Something shifted in them. Not softness exactly, more like recognition of a specific kind of situation. "This the Monroe girl?" "Yes, ma'am." "Heard about her." She looked at the street behind them. "You followed?" "Not that I could tell. Didn't want to take chances." She stepped back from the door. "Get inside then, both of you. The coffee's from this morning, but it's still hot." Her name was Clara, and she did not waste words, which Caleb appreciated. She put Lily at the kitchen table with a bowl of something hot, bean soup, thick, the kind that takes hours. And while Lily ate with the focused concentration of someone who hadn't had a real meal in days, Clara stood against the counter and listened to what Caleb had to say. He kept it short. The feed store man. What he'd learned about Samuel Monroe, the hired man on the street, the leather pouch. Clara didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. "Victor Hale's been trying to get hold of that spring property for 2 years, she said finally. Samuel Monroe stood in his way. Samuel was quiet about it, careful, but he had the documents and Hale knew it. She paused. Then Samuel had his accident. "How many people in this town think it was an accident?" Caleb said. "Depends on what you mean by think," Clara said. "Most people here know what they know and say what's safe. Different things." Lily looked up from her soup. "Mr. Hale killed my papa," she said. Not as a question, not even with particular anger, just as a fact she had arrived at over 15 days on those steps and had finished processing. Clara looked at her for a moment. I don't know that for certain, honey. I do, Lily said, and went back to her soup. Caleb and Clara exchanged a look over her head. Clara's expression said quietly that she thought Lily might be right, and also that being right about something like that was its own kind of burden. She can stay here, Clara said. Tonight, at least. Maybe longer, depending on how things go. Hale will know she's here eventually, Caleb said. Someone will talk. Someone always talks, Clara agreed. But she'll be safer here than on those steps. And I have a shotgun and I know how to use it before you start worrying about whether I can manage the situation. Caleb hadn't been worried about that, actually. He'd gotten the measure of Clara Briggs fairly quickly. After Lily finished eating, she fell asleep on the narrow cot in Clara's spare room with a speed that suggested she'd barely slept in 2 weeks, which was probably accurate. Caleb sat at the kitchen table and Clara sat across from him, and they talked quietly for 2 hours about Blackridge Valley and the shape of what Victor Hale had built there. What Clara described was less dramatic than what people in other places might imagine when they heard the words, "powerful man controls a town." It wasn't thugs in the streets. It wasn't obvious threats, mostly. It was quieter than that, and in some ways, worse. Victor Hale had control because he held the mortgages on 14 of the 23 businesses in Blackridge Valley. He'd bought them up during a hard winter 3 years back, when money was short, and he was willing to lend at what seemed like reasonable terms, and turned out not to be. He had a lawyer who'd been in the valley longer than Hale himself, and understood every document filed in every proceeding for 20 years. He had the sheriff, a man named Poole, who had 2 sons and a wife and a mortgage on his house that Hale could call due inside of a month if he chose to. And he had patience, Clara said. He had the patience of someone who understood that small towns have long memories but short attention spans for problems that aren't their own. He watched Lily for 15 days, Clara said, not out of neglect. He was waiting to see if anyone would get involved. If nobody did, he'd file abandoned child paperwork within the week and take custody, and the papers would disappear, and that would be that. Caleb thought about the hired man on the street. And now someone got involved. Now someone got involved, Clara confirmed. And that's either going to make things easier or very considerably harder, and I don't know which yet. Harder, Caleb said. It's going to be harder. I'm just one man with $40, and he gestured vaguely. He's the valley, Clara finished. Right. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. What's in the papers? Haven't looked yet. Lily's been keeping them close. You'll need to. You'll need to understand what you're dealing with before Hale makes his next move. She paused. He'll move fast now that he knows. Caleb nodded. He already knew that. The hired man on the street hadn't been there by coincidence. Hale had known about Lily from the start, had been watching, and the moment Caleb picked her up and walked away, the clock had started running on whatever came next. He asked Clara if she knew any lawyers outside the valley who might be reached. She knew one. A man named Aldous Webb in a town called Fenton, 40 miles east. Webb had handled a water rights case 2 years back involving some valley landowners and had not made himself popular with Victor Hale in the process. Clara thought he was probably honest, or at least honest enough for the purpose. 40 miles in January, Caleb said. It's doable in 2 days if you push. I'd need someone to stay with Lily. I'm not going anywhere, Clara said, in a tone that made it clear she found the question slightly insulting. In the morning, before he did anything else, Caleb sat with Lily at the kitchen table while Clara found reasons to be in the other room, and he asked her to open the leather pouch. She did it carefully, the way she did most things, unhurried, precise, like someone who understood that carelessness had costs. Inside the pouch were 3 documents. 2 were handwritten, the ink slightly faded, on paper that had been folded and unfolded many times. The third was on heavier paper, more formal, with a stamp at the bottom that Caleb recognized as a territorial seal. He spread them on the table and looked at them for a long time. He was not a lawyer. He'd had 8 years of school, more than most men he'd ridden with, and he could read and cipher and follow an argument on paper, but contract law was not a thing he'd studied. What he could tell, though, was this. The first handwritten document was something that looked like a record of sale or a transfer of some kind, dated 13 years back, with his grandfather's name, Elias Monroe, not Samuel, at the top. The second was a letter, Samuel's handwriting, which Lily confirmed, detailing the history of the land claim and listing dates of residents and improvements. The third, the formal document, had language about water rights and prior claim that even Caleb could tell was significant because it was specific and it was dated, and the date was 9 years before the date on whatever claim Victor Hale had filed. Your grandfather had this land, Caleb said. He came here before most anyone, Lily said. He built the first structure near the spring. Papa said that meant something, legally, prior claim. It means a lot, Caleb said, if it holds up. Will it? He looked at the formal document again. I think so, but I'm not the person who needs to think so. A judge needs to think so. And before a judge, there needs to be a lawyer who can present this without giving Hale's lawyer time to undermine it. Lily was quiet, looking at the documents. Papa carried these for 2 years, she said, after Grandpa died. He said they were safer with him than in any building in this valley because Victor Hale owned the buildings. Your papa was right, Caleb said. He began carefully refolding the documents. I need to take these to a man named Aldous Webb. He's in Fenton. I'll be gone 2 days. Lily's expression went very still. You're leaving, she said. He heard what was underneath it, and he made himself address it directly rather than talking around it. I'm coming back, he said. That's a promise. And you'll be here with Mrs. Briggs, who has a shotgun, and I'm starting to think the kind of stubbornness that outlasts most problems. You don't know that you're coming back, Lily said quietly. Papa didn't know either. That hit him somewhere. He didn't try to pretend it hadn't. No, he said. I don't know for certain, but I'm going to do everything I can to make it true. And the difference between me leaving to find help and your papa's situation is that I'm going to be careful, and I'm going to come back here with someone who can read these papers in front of a court. That's the plan. She looked at him for a long moment. She wasn't a child who cried easily. He'd figured that out already. But he could see her working through something, the private arithmetic of someone who had already done the math on trusting people and found the results discouraging. Okay, she said at last. Just that. Okay. He understood it was more than it sounded. He left that afternoon, after copying down the key dates and names from the documents into his own notebook and tucking the originals back into Lily's keeping with the instruction that she show them to nobody, not even Clara, until he returned. Not because he didn't trust Clara, because the fewer people who knew exactly what those documents contained, the fewer people Hale could pressure for information. The road to Fenton was cold and empty, and gave him more time than he wanted alone with his own thoughts. He thought about what Clara had said about Hale watching Lily for 15 days. He thought about the particular cruelty of that, the patience of it, the calculation. A child on steps in January wasn't a problem to be solved for Victor Hale. She was a piece on a board, and waiting for her to simply stop being a problem, for some stranger to take her south toward the orphanage, or just for the cold to do its quiet work, had seemed to him like the most efficient approach. No mess, no confrontation, just patience. The thing about men like Victor Hale, Caleb thought, was not that they were unusual. The thing was that they were entirely ordinary, that the calculation was the same one, 100 small men in 100 small places had done 100 times. Power was not dramatic. Power was paperwork and patience, and knowing that most people, when pressed, would choose the path that cost them least. Caleb himself had spent 4 years being one of those people. He knew the path well. He reached Fenton on the second morning, his horse tired and his body stiff from the cold, and found Aldous Webb's office on the main street behind a painted sign that said, A. Webb, Land Law and Territorial Claims. He went inside without a clear sense of how this conversation was going to go. Webb was a small man in his 50s with spectacles and ink stains on his fingers that suggested he spent more time reading documents than doing anything else, which Caleb found reassuring. He listened to Caleb's summary with his hands folded on the desk and his expression revealing nothing. When Caleb finished, Webb said, Victor Hale. That's right. You know I had dealings with Hale 2 years ago. I heard that. I lost, Webb said flatly, not because I was wrong, because his lawyer found a technicality that let them delay the ruling until the other party couldn't afford to continue. That's useful to know, Caleb said. It's useful because it tells you what his strategy will be here, Webb said. He'll try to delay. He'll try to create complications, contradictions, questions about the legitimacy of the documents. He'll try to make it about you rather than about the papers, your background, your motives, whether you have the right to be involved at all. And he'll try to get the girl. Get her how? Custody filing. Abandoned minor. If he can establish legal guardianship over her before this goes to a hearing, he controls her access to the documents, and he controls what she's allowed to say in any proceeding. Caleb had not known about that specific angle. He felt something tighten in him. How fast can he do that? If he's been watching her for 15 days, he may have already filed, Webb said, or he may have been waiting to see how things developed. The moment you took her from those steps, you created a complicating factor he didn't anticipate. He'll need to reassess before he moves. The small man leaned back in his chair. That's your window. It's not large. Then we shouldn't waste it. Webb looked at him steadily. Mr. Hunter, I need to ask you something before we go any further. What is your relationship to this child? I gave her a biscuit 4 days ago, Caleb said. That's the whole of it. That's not a relationship that gives you legal standing. I know that. So why are you here? Why are you involved at all? Caleb looked at the ink stains on Webb's desk. He thought about how to answer the question honestly, without it sounding like something he didn't mean. Because everybody else walked past, he said finally. And I couldn't. Webb looked at him for a moment longer. Then he picked up his pen. Tell me about the documents. Every detail you can remember, Caleb told him. By the time they finished, it was dark outside. Webb had filled 6 pages with notes. He had a way of asking follow-up questions that drilled down into specifics. Not the what, but the when. Not the who, but the in what capacity. Caleb answered everything he could and was honest about the gaps in what he knew. By the end, Webb looked at him with something that might have been respect, or at least professional interest. The prior claim document, Webb said, if it is what you've described, the territorial seal, the date, the grandfather's name, is significant, very significant. It establishes a record of claim that predates anything Hale could have filed. That is not easily overturned. He paused. But it needs to be seen. It needs to be filed with the territorial court, and the filing needs to happen before Hale's lawyer can create a counterfiling that muddies the waters. How long does that take? If I leave tomorrow and you bring me back to the documents, and the documents are what you say they are? A week, maybe less. Webb set down his pen. My fee is $40. Caleb almost laughed. He had exactly 42. I can manage that, he said. He rode back the next morning with Webb behind him in a buggy, moving slower than Caleb would have liked, but faster than Webb seemed entirely comfortable with. They didn't talk much on the road. Caleb was listening to the landscape the way he'd learned to listen to it in years of moving through places where not every ridge was innocent, and Webb was bundled in his coat reviewing his own notes with a kind of self-contained focus that suggested the cold barely registered next to whatever was happening in his head. They reached Clara's place in the last light of the second day. Clara met them at the door with the shotgun not quite pointed at them, which he'd come to understand was her version of a warm welcome. When she recognized him, she lowered it. You made good time, she said. How is she? Sleeping. She slept a lot, ate a lot more. Clara looked at Webb. This the lawyer? Aldous Webb, Webb said, getting down from the buggy. You honest? Clara asked him directly. Webb seemed mildly taken aback. I try to be. That'll do, I suppose. She stepped back. Come in. I'll heat something. Lily was awake by the time they got inside, standing in the doorway to the back room in her socks, her hair loose, looking at Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read, and then looking at Webb with an expression that was distinctly cautious. This is Aldous Webb, Caleb said. He's a lawyer. He's going to help us. He works for you? Lily asked Webb directly. I work for your interests, Webb said carefully, for the documents and what they represent. That's not the same as working for me, Lily said. Webb paused. He looked at her with something that changed slightly in his face. You're right, he said. It's not. So let me be clear. I'm going to read your papers, and if they say what Mr. Hunter believes they say, I'm going to do everything in my legal power to make sure those papers end up in front of a judge before Victor Hale can prevent it. Your land, your inheritance, your father's work. He paused. Is that sufficient? Lily considered him for a long moment. Yes, she said, that's sufficient. She went to the corner where her coat was hanging and reached inside and pulled out the leather pouch, and she crossed the room and held it out to Webb. He took it with both hands. He set it on the table and began to open it carefully, and the kitchen was very quiet while he did. Caleb watched Lily while Webb read. She stood a few feet back, arms crossed, watching the lawyer's face with the attention of someone who had learned that faces told you more than words when the stakes were real. Her jaw was set and her eyes were steady, and standing there in her socks in Clara's kitchen, she looked like a small person who contained a very large amount of something that wasn't going to bend. Webb read for a long time. He read each document twice. He made notes. He held the formal document up toward the lamp and looked at the territorial seal. Then he set everything down and looked up, and his expression had changed. "These are genuine," he said. "All three." The room was very quiet. "The prior claim filing from Elias Monroe," Webb continued, "is dated June 1851. Victor Hale's land acquisition in this area, from his own public filings, began in 1857 at the earliest. Elias Monroe was here first, and there is a complete unbroken chain of family residence documented in these pages." He looked at Lily. "Your grandfather built his first structure at the spring in 1849. He filed this formal claim in 1851. Your father inherited it in 1868 and updated the documentation in 1871. Every date holds." Webb paused. "Hale's claim to this property has no legal foundation. It never did." Lily said nothing. She just stood there with her arms still crossed, and something moved through her face that was too complex and too private for Caleb to put a name to. "So the land is hers," Caleb said. "The land is hers," Webb confirmed, "but we are not done. These documents need to be in the hands of the territorial court before Hale moves to complicate this. We have, I estimate, 3 to 5 days before his next action, possibly less." He began carefully refolding the papers. "And there is still the question of the sheriff and local cooperation. And there is the broader question of whatever Victor Hale does when he realizes his plan has failed." "He won't take it lying down," Clara said from the stove. "No," Webb agreed. "He very much won't." And that was the thing about proving something was true, Caleb thought, looking around the kitchen at Clara and Webb and Lily standing in her socks. Proving it was only the beginning. The truth didn't protect itself. The truth needed people willing to stand in front of it. They had the papers. They had a lawyer. They had a woman with a shotgun and a cot and bean soup. What they didn't have was any illusion that Victor Hale was going to let this go. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the valley, the cold held everything tight. And Caleb thought about the hired man on the street, about the way he'd stood and watched them walk away without moving, and he thought, that man reported back. He reported everything. And right now, in a large, comfortable office in the large, comfortable building at the end of Main Street, a patient, calculating man who had built an empire on other people's fear was sitting with that information and deciding what to do next. He'd been patient enough to watch a child for 15 days. He wasn't going to be patient much longer. Webb said they had 3 to 5 days. He was wrong. They had 1. Caleb figured it out at first light the next morning when he looked out Clara's front window and saw fresh horse tracks in the mud on the road. 3 sets, coming from the direction of town, stopping about 100 yards from the house, then turning back. Someone had ridden out in the night, not to the house but close enough to it, close enough to confirm that there was a horse and a buggy outside that hadn't been there 2 days ago. He didn't wake Clara. He stood at the window for a few minutes, thinking through it, and then went and woke Webb instead. Webb took the news the way Caleb was coming to expect from him. No panic, just a rapid, quiet reorganization of the internal timeline. He sat on the edge of the cot in the spare room where he'd slept, still in his clothes because he'd apparently gone to sleep fully dressed just in case, and he said, "Then we file today." "The territorial court is in Millhaven," Caleb said. "That's 3 hours south." "I know where it is." Webb was already putting on his boots. "We need the documents. We need to be on the road inside an hour. And we need someone to stay with the girl who isn't you." "Why not me?" Webb looked up. "Because when we arrive in Millhaven with these documents, there is a reasonable chance that someone will have already sent word to Hale's lawyer there, which means there may be a complication at the courthouse that requires more than legal argument to resolve." He paused meaningfully. "I would prefer to have someone with me who has experience with complications." Caleb understood. "Clara stays with Lily. Unless you have a better arrangement." He didn't. Lily was awake when he came to tell her, sitting up on the cot with her knees pulled to her chest, and he had the impression she'd been awake for a while already, that she'd heard him moving around and had been lying there in the dark, working through the possibilities. "You're leaving again," she said. "With the documents this time, to file them." She was quiet. He could see her processing it, the particular stillness of someone doing fast, private arithmetic. "If something happens to you on the road," she said, "and Hale's men get the papers, then we're back where we started," he said. "I know. So we shouldn't put everything in one place." She looked at him with those old eyes. "That's what Papa said. Don't put everything in one place." He thought about it. She wasn't wrong. Samuel Monroe had kept the documents on his daughter's body rather than in any building because he understood that a single point of failure was a plan that failed. The logic held. "What are you thinking?" he said. "Webb takes the formal document," she said. "The territorial seal one. That's the strongest. You keep the letter Papa wrote, the history of the land, and I keep Grandpa's transfer document here," she paused. "If something happens to any one of us, the other two still have pieces." He looked at her. I was 31 years old, and he'd met very few adults who thought the way she'd just described. "That's good thinking," he said. "Papa taught me," she said quietly. They divided the documents the way she'd described. Webb accepted the arrangement without argument, which told Caleb he respected it. Clara made them biscuits and didn't say much, but when Caleb came out to the buggy, she handed him a canvas bag with food for the road and put her hand briefly on his arm and said, "Be careful. Come back with something that matters." He intended to do both. The road to Millhaven ran south through open country, flat and wide and cold, with the kind of January sky that sat low and gray and pressed everything down toward the earth. Webb drove the buggy. Caleb rode beside him. They moved faster than they had on the road from Fenton because neither of them had any inclination to take their time. For the first hour, nothing followed them. Caleb kept watching anyway. He had a way of watching that didn't look like watching, his eyes moving at the horizon, at the ridgelines, at any place where a rider could wait without being obvious. There were too many of those places on this road. The country was too open for comfort and not open enough for certainty. It was Webb who first noticed the riders, which surprised him. 2:00, Webb said quietly, without turning his head. "Behind the eastern ridge. They've been there since we left the creek crossing." Caleb didn't turn either. "How many?" "2, maybe 3. Hard to say from the dust pattern." He thought through options. Millhaven was still 2 hours ahead. The riders were pacing them, not closing, which meant they weren't planning to stop them on the road. Or not yet. Maybe they were waiting for a better spot. Maybe they were just keeping track. "Keep the same pace," Caleb said. "Don't speed up. Speeding up would suggest we know they're there." "Right." Webb kept his eyes on the road. "Are you armed, Mr. Hunter?" "I am." "Good." A pause. "I'm not." "I noticed." They rode in silence for a while. The riders on the ridge maintained their distance. Caleb spent the time thinking about what Victor Hale actually wanted here, what outcome served him best. Stopping them on the road would be crude and obvious, the kind of thing that created exactly the kind of attention Hale generally tried to avoid. Hale preferred documents and delays and legal maneuvers, not open confrontation on a public road. But if he'd decided the situation was desperate enough, he hadn't decided that yet. That was Caleb's read, because if Hale had decided that, the riders would have been at the house last night, not on a ridge 200 yards back keeping pace. Hale was still trying to find a clean way out of this. He hadn't gone to the ugly answer yet. The question was how close he was to it. They reached Millhaven at midday. The territorial courthouse was a 2-story stone building on the main square, more substantial than anything in Black Ridge Valley, with the slight air of importance that government buildings in small western towns sometimes had, like they were trying to convince everyone, including themselves, that the law was solid here. Caleb felt a fractional sense of relief when they pulled up in front of it. The riders on the ridge had dropped back 5 miles outside Millhaven and not reappeared. Whether they'd turned back or simply found a less visible position, he didn't know. Inside the courthouse, Webb moved with the authority of a man who understood the specific geography of legal bureaucracy. He knew which window to approach, which form to request, which clerk to speak to about urgency and prior claim filings. Caleb stood back and let him work, because he'd learned in 2 days of traveling with Webb that the man was most effective when not being helped by people who didn't know what they were doing. It took 40 minutes. There was a problem. There was always a problem. Caleb was beginning to understand that legal processes generated problems the way old wood generated splinters. having to do with the fact that the original 1851 filing had been made under a territorial designation that no longer technically existed under the current administrative structure. Webb argued through it with a calm persistence that didn't raise his voice once, but also didn't yield an inch. The clerk consulted a supervisor. The supervisor consulted a ledger that was old enough that its spine had given out and it was held together with twine. Then the supervisor looked at the territorial seal on the document and looked at Webb and said, "This is a genuine prior claim filing." "Yes," Webb said, "it is. Victor Hale has filed a counterclaim on this property." "I'm aware of that. When was it filed?" The supervisor consulted the ledger again. 14 months ago. "The Monroe family claim predates it by 6 years," Webb said. "I am filing a formal challenge and a request for expedited review on the grounds that the claimant, one Lily Monroe, minor daughter of the deceased Samuel Monroe, is being actively disadvantaged by the delay." There was more consultation, more ledger. Caleb stood against the wall with his hat in his hands and tried to look like someone who belonged in a courthouse, rather than someone who'd spent the last 4 years specifically avoiding places where laws were discussed at length. In the end, the filing went through. Webb came back to where Caleb was standing with the receipt in his hand, and he let out a breath that was the closest thing to emotional expression Caleb had seen from him. "Filed," Webb said. "Expedited review, which means a hearing within 30 days rather than 6 months." He looked at the receipt. "Hale's lawyer will know about this by tomorrow morning at the latest." "And then?" "And then things get more difficult," Webb said simply. "Because now there is a legal proceeding, and Hale cannot stop it by making the documents disappear. He will have to fight it in court, which means he will look for other angles." He folded the receipt carefully. "The girl. He'll move on the girl." They rode back hard. Caleb pushed the pace in a way that wasn't quite fair to the horses, but that the situation required, and Webb didn't complain, just held on and kept his hat from blowing off, and kept his own counsel about whatever he was thinking. The riders didn't reappear on the return road. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. It was late afternoon when they turned up the lane toward Clara's, and Caleb saw it before he heard it. The horses tied out front that weren't his or Webb's, 3 of them, good horses. The kind of horses that belonged to men who were paid well enough that their employer chose their mounts. He was off his horse before the buggy fully stopped. He went in through the back. The kitchen was too quiet, the wrong kind of quiet, and he moved through it fast and came into the front room to find Clara sitting very straight in her chair, with her shotgun not in her hands but on the floor 4 feet away, and Sheriff Poole standing by the door with 2 of his deputies, and in the corner of the room, standing against the wall with her coat on and the leather pouch nowhere visible, was Lily. She looked at Caleb when he came in. Her face was still, but her eyes said, "You came back." Poole turned around. He was a heavy man, not tall, with the look of someone who had been uncomfortable with himself for a long time and had made a kind of professional peace with it. He had a badge and he had a folded document in his hand, and he had the expression of a man doing a job he didn't enjoy but was going to do anyway because not doing it was scarier than doing it. "Hunter," he said. "Sheriff." Caleb kept his voice level. He didn't look at the shotgun on the floor. Not yet. "What's the occasion?" Poole held up the document. "Court order. Emergency guardianship filing for Lily Monroe, minor female, on grounds of abandonment and absence of legal guardian." He paused. "I'm authorized to take her into protective custody pending a hearing." "Filed by whom?" Caleb said. Poole's jaw tightened slightly. "Filed by Victor Hale on behalf of himself," Caleb said. "Let's be accurate about it." "Filed through proper legal channels," Poole said, louder. "This is a legitimate order, Hunter, and you interfering with it puts you in violation of—" "We've filed a counterclaim," Webb said from the doorway. Everyone looked. Webb had come in behind Caleb without Caleb noticing, which meant the man was quieter on his feet than he looked. I was holding his own document, the courthouse receipt, and he held it up with the same calm that he held most things. "Aldous Webb," he said to Poole. "I represent the interests of Lily Monroe in the matter of the Monroe family land claim, which was filed with the territorial court in Mill Haven this morning. The filing includes a formal challenge to any and all counterclaims by Victor Hale on the same property, and I have here a receipt demonstrating the prior nature of the Monroe claim." He crossed the room and held the receipt out to Poole. If you take this child into custody under a guardianship order filed by the man whose property claim is being legally challenged, you are placing yourself and your office in a direct conflict of interest that will be very difficult to explain to a territorial judge in 30 days. Poole looked at the receipt. He looked at it for a long time. One of the deputies shifted his weight. The other one was looking at the floor, the way people look at floors when they're hoping not to be called upon to do something they'll regret. That's not, Poole started. 30 days, Sheriff, Webb said. That's all I'm asking you to consider. In 30 days, there will be a hearing and a judge will determine the legal status of this child's inheritance. If you take her now, before that hearing, you are not protecting her. You are removing her access to the legal process that determines her future. He paused. That will be on record. Everything will be on record. The room held its silence. Caleb was watching Poole, watching the thing that moved through the man's face. The calculation, the weighing, the same weighing that everyone in Black Ridge Valley did all the time. The math of what this costs against what that costs. Only this time, the calculation was being done in front of witnesses, which changed the variables. She stays here, Caleb said quietly, under Clara Briggs's roof, with a lawyer present and a receipt that proves the legal process is already running. You come back with that order in 31 days, after a judge has ruled, and we'll have a different conversation. But today you go back to town and you tell Victor Hale that the paperwork didn't go the way he planned. Poole looked at him. He looked at Lily, who was standing against the wall not saying anything, watching the adults with that particular quality of attention she had, the kind that suggested she was recording everything and would not forget. Something happened in Poole's face. It was small and not quite decisive and might not have looked like much to someone who wasn't watching closely. But Caleb was watching closely. He picked up the document from where he'd set it on the table. I'll be back, Poole said, when that hearing's done. We'll be here, Webb said. Poole walked to the door. His deputies followed, in the manner of men who are relieved to be following rather than leading. At the door, Poole stopped and said, without turning around, Mrs. Briggs, I'm sorry about your shotgun. Clara said nothing. The door closed. The boots on the porch. The horses outside. The sound of them leaving, gradually fading down the lane, until there was just the kitchen sounds, and the fire in the stove, and the particular texture of a silence that comes after something has been held together by effort. Clara picked up her shotgun off the floor. She checked it, more out of principle than necessity, and leaned it back against the wall. He took it when he came in, she said, by way of explanation. I let him because fighting 3 of them in my own kitchen seemed like a poor use of resources. She looked at Caleb. Did you file? We filed. She nodded once. Good. Lily had crossed the room while nobody was watching and was standing beside Caleb now, not holding his hand, not touching him at all, just positioned close in the way that people stand close to things that feel solid when everything else is uncertain. He looked down at her. You all right? He said. They were here for 2 hours, she said. They kept asking where the papers were. A pause. I told them I didn't know what papers they meant. He felt something ease in his chest that had been very tight. Where were they? She reached inside her coat and produced the transfer document, her grandfather's, the one she'd kept, folded inside what looked like an ordinary piece of cloth. Sewn into the lining, she said. I did it last night. Papa taught me that, too. He looked at her. He genuinely did not know what to say for a moment. Your papa, he said finally, was a thorough man. He was scared, she said. Scared makes you thorough. That was maybe the truest thing anyone had said to him in years, and he stood there with the weight of it settling into him alongside everything else. The filed receipt in Webb's pocket, the riders on the ridge, Poole's face at the door, the hired man on the street on the first day. And before all of that, a child on steps in January with 15 notches in the wood and her father's eyes. But the night didn't stay quiet. Caleb slept light, the way he'd learned to sleep over 4 years of not having walls he fully trusted. And sometime around 2 in the morning, he heard something outside that wasn't wind and wasn't an animal. I was up and at the window before the sound had finished registering, and what he saw in the moonlight was 2 men at the edge of Clara's property line, standing still, looking at the house. Not approaching, just standing. He watched them for 10 minutes. They didn't move. It was a message. It was Victor Hale saying, I know where you are, and I know where she is, and the sheriff with the receipt didn't change what I'm willing to do. Caleb dressed in the dark and went and woke Webb and told him what was outside. Webb listened, then said, "He's testing whether you'll make a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "Going out there, confronting them, doing something that gives him a different kind of legal angle. If you assault his men on your own aggression, suddenly you're the problem." Caleb had already figured that. It didn't make standing at the window watching them any easier. "So we wait," Caleb said. "We wait," Webb confirmed. "And in the morning, we start thinking about who else in this valley might be willing to say something on Lily's behalf. Because documents are essential, but a hearing goes better when there are human beings willing to stand up in front of a judge and say what they've seen." "Some of them," Webb said. "But fear isn't permanent. Fear is a calculation, just like everything else. When people start to believe the calculation is changing, when they see that someone pushed back and didn't immediately disappear, sometimes the calculation changes too." In the morning, the men outside were gone, but they'd left something. Caleb found it when he went out to check the horses, a piece of paper, folded, tucked into the door of the barn. He opened it and read it and stood there in the cold morning air with it in his hand for a long moment. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was simpler than that. It was a number that represented what Victor Hale was willing to pay Caleb Hunter to leave Black Ridge Valley and not come back. The number was $1,200. He stood there with the cold in his lungs and the paper in his hand, and he thought about $42. He thought about a horse with a bad leg. He thought about 4 years of empty roads, and the particular skill he'd developed at not being attached to anything. $1,200 was more money than he'd had in one place at any point in the last decade. It was enough to go somewhere new and start something real. It was enough to matter. He stood there long enough that Clara came to the barn door and saw him. She looked at the paper. She didn't ask what it said. She just looked at his face. "Well?" she said. He folded the paper. He put it in his pocket. He went back inside. He didn't answer her. He didn't need to. She'd seen what she needed to see in his face, and she nodded once and went back to making breakfast, and that was the end of it. At the table, Lily was eating oatmeal and not talking, doing that thing she did sometimes where she went somewhere private inside herself that showed in the slight distance of her eyes. She looked up when Caleb came in and sat down, and she watched him pour coffee, and then she said, "He tried to buy you off." He looked at her. "Papa said that's what he does when the other thing doesn't work," she said. "He said Hale's first move is fear, and his second move is money, and his third move is whatever's left after that." "What did your papa say about the third move?" Lily looked at her oatmeal. "He said that's when you find out what kind of man you're dealing with." Caleb wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. The warmth of it came through his palms and up into his wrists, and he sat with it and thought about what was coming, about the 30 days between now and the hearing, about Victor Hale's third move, and what it looked like when a man like that ran out of clean options. He thought about the hired men on the ridge, the sheriff with the order, the paper in the barn. He thought about what came next when none of those worked. He wasn't naive enough to think this was going to stay civilized just because they'd filed papers and won one afternoon standoff in a kitchen. Men like Victor Hale didn't build what he'd built by accepting the first setback gracefully. He was going to escalate. He was going to find the edge of what was legally defensible, and he was going to stand right on it, and then he was going to look for the moment when the legal route ran out and something else became necessary. And Caleb Hunter sitting in Clara Briggs's kitchen with $40 left and a receipt for a courthouse filing and a little girl who sewed things into coat linings because her father had taught her that scared made you thorough. Caleb Hunter was going to be standing in the way when that moment came. He'd understood that from the first morning. He'd understood it when he walked back to those steps and sat down beside her. He'd understood it in the barn just now when he folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He was not leaving. He'd run from enough things. He was done with running. That was the part that scared him most, he realized. Not Hale, not the hired men, not the 30 days of uncertainty ahead. What scared him was how completely he meant it. Outside, the valley waited in its January cold, patient as everything that understood it had time. And somewhere in town, in a large, comfortable office with good furniture and warm light, Victor Hale was sitting with the news that his money had also failed, and he was moving on to whatever came next. Whatever it was, Caleb thought, it was coming soon. The 30 days before the hearing were the longest Caleb had spent in one place since before his family died. That was the thing about waiting. It gave you time to think, and thinking, when you'd spent 4 years specifically not doing it, had a way of ambushing you at inconvenient hours. He'd wake up at 3 in the morning and lie there in the narrow cot in Clara's spare room, staring at the ceiling while the cold pressed against the window, and things he hadn't let himself look at directly in years would come and sit with him in the dark, whether he wanted them there or not. His wife's name had been Margaret. His son had been 4 years old and had been called Thomas after Caleb's father, a naming decision Caleb had argued against at the time and would have given anything to take back. The fever had come through their small settlement in the fall, one of those invisible, devastating things that didn't announce itself until it was already too late to outrun, and in the space of 11 days, Caleb had gone from a man with a life to a man with nothing but the habit of continuing. He hadn't talked about this to anyone, not in 4 years. He wasn't going to start now. But lying awake in Clara's spare room with the winter pressing down outside, he found himself thinking about Thomas, about how old he'd be now, and the thought had a specific weight to it that he'd learned to carry, but never quite learned to put down. What he hadn't expected, what he would not have predicted when he sat down on those steps with half a biscuit, was the way Lily's presence in the house changed the quality of those 3 in the morning hours, not fixed them, not erased anything. She'd come to the doorway of his room once, maybe 10 days in, because she'd had a bad dream and was too proud to say so directly, and she'd stood there in the dark in her socks and said, "I heard something outside," which they both knew wasn't quite true. He'd sat up and said, "There's nothing there, I checked an hour ago," which she knew meant he'd been awake, and she'd stood there for another moment and then said, "Okay," and gone back to her room. But after that, she sometimes fell asleep faster, and he sometimes did too, and he thought that might be its own kind of quiet truth about what they were to each other by then, in this house, in these 30 days. Not a thing with a name yet, just a presence that made the dark slightly less heavy. Webb was in and out over those weeks, riding between Clara's place and Mill Haven, and once all the way to the county seat in Harker's Point to file supplementary documents and consult with the territorial judge's clerk about procedural matters that he explained to Caleb in detail, and that Caleb followed about 60% of. The core of it was this: they had the prior claim, the dates held, and the 3 documents together told a complete story that Hale's counterclaim couldn't legally overcome on its merits. The problem, there was always a problem, was that Hale's lawyer, a man named Cresswell, who had been operating in the territory for 15 years, was very good at attacking on grounds other than merits. He'll try to establish that the documents are fraudulent, Webb said, on one of the evenings when he was back at Clara's kitchen table with papers spread in front of him. He can't prove that because they aren't, but he can raise enough procedural doubt to delay a ruling, and delay works against us. Why does delay work against us more than him? Caleb asked. He's the one trying to take something. Because the guardianship question is still open, Webb said. The emergency order Poole brought was turned back on procedural grounds, but Hale can refile it through a different court, a different judge. If he gets the guardianship established before the land hearing concludes, Lily becomes his ward, and he becomes the person who manages her legal interests during the proceeding. He paused to let that sink in. At which point, he can simply choose not to contest his own claim on her behalf. Caleb looked at Lily, who was across the table doing the arithmetic lessons Clara had been giving her because school hadn't been an option for the last several weeks. She was working through a long division problem with the focused frown she got when something was resisting her, and she wasn't looking up. "We need witnesses," Caleb said. "Yes," Webb agreed. "People in Black Ridge Valley who saw things, who know things." "Yes." "People who are afraid of losing their mortgages and their livelihoods and who have been very careful not to be involved in any of this." "Also yes," Webb said, "which is why I need you to go talk to them. Because I'm a lawyer from Fenton and they have no reason to trust me, and you are," he considered, "something else." "I'm a drifter who picked up a child," Caleb said. "You're a man who didn't walk away," Webb said. "In this town, right now, that's not nothing." He went into Black Ridge Valley for the first time since the day he'd taken Lily from those steps. It felt different now. Not safer. If anything, less safe. Because now he was known, and what he was known for was specifically what Victor Hale didn't want him to be known for. But different. He walked down Main Street and he could feel the way people's eyes tracked him, the particular attention of a place that had been waiting to see what happened next and had just gotten a new data point. The feed store man's name was Garrett. Caleb went there first because Garrett had already talked to him once, already taken the small risk of saying Samuel Monroe's name out loud in a past tense way, and that made him the most likely candidate for taking the next small risk. Garrett was alone in the store when Caleb came in. He looked up and his expression went through three things in quick succession: recognition, wariness, and then something more complicated that wasn't quite resolved but was maybe the beginning of it. "Heard you're still in town," Garrett said. "Still here," Caleb confirmed. "Heard you filed papers in Millhaven." "Word travels." Garrett straightened some things that didn't need straightening. "Hale knows it too." "I figured." A silence. The store was warm, wood stove in the corner, the smell of grain and leather and oil. Outside, the street sounds of the ordinary morning continued without interest in what was happening in here. "What do you want from me?" Garrett asked. He said it directly, which Caleb respected. "There's a hearing in 9 days," Caleb said. "Territorial Court, Millhaven. The judge needs to understand the land claim situation. The prior claim, what Samuel Monroe had, why it's legitimate. But he also needs to understand the pattern, the way things work in this valley." He looked at Garrett steadily. "You saw Victor Hale's men watching that girl every day for 15 days. You saw them and you walked past." Garrett's jaw tightened. That's not a comfortable thing for a man to hear said out loud. "No, but it's true, and you know it's true. And I'm not here to make you feel bad about it because I understand why people do what they do when someone holds their livelihood over them." Caleb paused. "I'm here to ask whether that's still the choice you want to make. Now that there's a hearing, now that there's a judge who's going to be looking at what happened here." Garrett was quiet for a long time, long enough that Caleb let the silence be, let it do its own work. "What would I have to say?" Garrett asked finally. "Specifically, what you saw, what you know about the Monroe family claim, what you told me about Samuel's death and the timing of Hale's interest in the land." Caleb held his gaze. "Just the truth. Nothing more than what you already know." Another long pause. "My mortgage," Garrett said. "I know. Hale calls it due the day after that hearing. If I testify against him, I lose this store." "I know that too. So why would I—" "Because right now you have a mortgage and a store, and you also have this," Caleb said quietly. "You have knowing what you saw and what you did about it. And I'm not saying that's unbearable, because most people live with worse. But I'm asking you whether the hearing changes the calculation. Whether knowing that a judge is going to look at what happened here, whether that changes what it costs you to stay quiet." Garrett looked out the window. A long moment. "I can't promise you," he said. "Not today." "I'm not asking for a promise today," Caleb said. "I'm asking you to think about it." He left and went to find the woman named Mrs. Greer, who had left a roll on the step 2 days into Lily's 15 days, and then kept walking. She was in her 60s, a widow who ran the town's only dressmaking operation out of the front room of her house on the east side of Main Street. She was harder to approach because she was frightened in a different way than Garrett, not of losing a business, but of something more fundamental, the fear of a woman alone who had learned that visibility invited risk. She opened the door 4 inches when he knocked and looked at him through the gap. "I know who you are," she said. "I know you do," Caleb said. "I also know you left a roll on those steps. I know you saw her." The 4 inches didn't change. "I have nothing to say about any of that." "Mrs. Greer." He kept his voice low and even. "Her name is Lily. She's 7 years old and she sewed her grandfather's deed into her coat lining because her father taught her that scared makes you thorough. She's been keeping those papers alive for 2 months since before her father died, because Samuel Monroe understood that the only thing that stood between his daughter and Victor Hale was a piece of paper and someone willing to stand behind it." He paused. "You left her a roll. You couldn't walk all the way past. I think that means something about what you're willing to do." The door gap held. "The hearing is in 9 days," he said. "Millhaven. Think about it." He had 7 more conversations over the next 4 days. The results were mixed in the way that human beings are always mixed. Some people who seemed solid went quiet when pressed, and one person he'd written off entirely, a man named Deke Sutton, who ran the livery and had a reputation for keeping his head down, said almost immediately, and with a kind of exhausted relief, "I've been waiting for someone to ask. I saw Hale's man watching that girl every morning. I saw him report back. I can say that. He said it like setting down something heavy he'd been carrying without acknowledgement. Clara, when Caleb reported back on all of this, said, 4 possibilities and 1 certain. That's what we have, he said. Is it enough? Ask Webb. Webb, when asked, said, enough for a foundation, not enough for the kind of case that leaves no room for doubt. We need one more thing. He looked at his notes. We need something that connects Hale directly to the night of Samuel Monroe's death. Right now we have a suspicious pattern. The timing, the land interest, the watching of the girl. But suspicious is not the same as proven, and Cresswell will use that gap. There's no evidence of that, Caleb said. Monroe died in a canyon, Hale's men found him, the sheriff called it an accident. That's the official record, Webb said. But official records are made by people, and people make them in specific circumstances, under specific pressures. Is there anyone who was present at the scene? Anyone who knows what was actually found there, beyond what Poole put in his report? Caleb thought about it. I'd have to go back to town. It was on his 4th day back in Black Ridge Valley, asking careful questions in the oblique way he'd gotten better at over these weeks, that he found out about a man named Roy Vass. Roy Vass had been one of Hale's riders for 3 years. He'd left Hale's employment 6 months ago under circumstances. Nobody seemed to want to discuss clearly, and he was now living in a 2-room cabin 4 miles north of town, doing odd jobs and mostly staying away from people. Caleb heard his name from Deke Sutton, who said only, "Talk to Roy Vass. I don't know what he'll say, but talk to him." He found Vass's cabin on a gray February afternoon, thin smoke from the chimney, a dog that barked twice and then wagged. Vass himself came to the door and looked at Caleb the way a man looks at an unexpected visitor when he spent 6 months specifically not being found. He was maybe 40, lean, with hands that had the roughened look of outdoor work, and eyes that had the cautious look of a man who'd made at least one decision he was still living inside. "Roy Vass," Caleb said. "Who's asking?" Caleb told him his name and why he was there, straightforwardly, without maneuvering, because he'd gotten the sense from what Sutton said that Vass would respond to direct and shut down completely to anything that smelled like it was working toward something sideways. Vass listened. He leaned against the door frame and listened to all of it, Lily, the papers, the filing, the hearing, without interrupting. When Caleb finished, there was a silence. "You left Hale's employ 6 months ago," Caleb said, "around the same time Samuel Monroe had his accident." Vass said nothing. "I'm not here to cause trouble for you," Caleb said. "I'm here because a 7-year-old girl's future is being decided in 9 days in a courtroom, and if the only story a judge hears is Victor Hale's story, she loses everything her family spent 30 years building." Vass was quiet for a long time. The dog sat down next to him and leaned against his leg. "I wasn't there," Vass said finally. "When Monroe died. I need to be clear about that." "Okay," Caleb said. "But I know who was. And I know what was said about it afterward, in a conversation I was present for, between Hale and his foreman." He stopped. "If I say what I know, he'll know it was me. There are only 2 people who heard that conversation, and the other one still works for him." "I can't promise you it won't be difficult," Caleb said. "I can tell you that Webb, my lawyer, will do everything in his power to establish your testimony as corroborated by the documentary evidence. So you're not the only thing standing between Hale and his version of events." Vass looked at him. "Why are you doing this? You rode into town 6 weeks ago. You don't know this girl." "I know her now," Caleb said. It wasn't a complete answer. He knew it wasn't. But Vass looked at him for a long moment and seemed to decide it was the honest version, which was sometimes worth more than a complete one. "Let me think on it," Vass said. Caleb gave him Webb's name and the Millhaven courthouse address and rode back to Clara's in the failing afternoon light, not knowing if Vass would come forward or disappear deeper into his cabin and his silence. He couldn't force it. He'd asked everything he could ask. The hearing was in 5 days. He told Webb about Vass, and Webb said, carefully, that if Vass testified to what Caleb had described, it changed the shape of the case significantly. Not just the land claim, the broader picture of how Victor Hale operated, how he used fear and proximity, and the specific silence of people who knew things but understood the cost of saying them. A judge who saw that pattern clearly would rule differently than a judge who saw only a document dispute between 2 competing land claims. "And if Vass doesn't come?" Caleb asked. Then we present what we have, and we trust that the documents are strong enough to stand on their own, Webb said, which I believe they are, but Cresswell will have prepared for the documents. He won't have prepared for a witness who was inside Hale's operation. Nobody can prepare for what they don't know is coming, Caleb said. Exactly, Webb said. The night before they left for Millhaven, Caleb found Lily sitting on the back step of Clara's house in the cold, looking at the stars. She had her coat on and her hands in her pockets, and she was doing the thing she did sometimes where she went very still in a way that was different from sadness, more like concentration. He sat down beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. I keep trying to remember what his voice sounded like, she said. Papa's voice. It's only been 2 months and I'm already losing pieces of it. He didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say to it. Is that normal? She asked. Yeah, he said. It's normal. She was quiet again. Then, you lost people too. It wasn't a question. He'd been careful not to tell her anything directly, but she'd been watching him for 6 weeks, and she was a child who paid attention. Yes, he said. Do you still remember their voices? He thought about Margaret's laugh, which had always been slightly louder than she intended. He thought about Thomas saying his name, Daddy, the way small children say it when they run towards you, and it's both a greeting and a declaration. Some of it, he said. Not all of it, but some. She absorbed this. I don't want to forget. You won't forget what matters, he said. The rest, he paused. The rest you keep in other ways, in what he taught you. The things you do because he showed you how. She thought about this. Sewing things into coat linings, she said. Yeah, he said. Things like that. She leaned slightly, just slightly, against his arm. He didn't move. They sat there on the cold step and looked at the stars, which were bright and indifferent and very far away. And he thought about the morning 5 days from now when a judge in Millhaven was going to look at 3 documents and hear from people who decided the cost of silence had finally outweighed the cost of speaking. And he thought about all the things that could go wrong between now and then. He also thought about what she'd said in Clara's kitchen on the first morning, about her father not abandoning her. He fought for her until the very end. He'd carried that without examining it too closely, but sitting here now, he found he was examining it. Samuel Monroe had been afraid. He'd been afraid enough to sew documents into places, to plan for his own disappearance, to choose a specific set of steps on a specific public street for a specific reason. He'd been afraid, and he'd been thorough, and he'd been running out of time, and he'd arranged what he could arrange, and then gone out to face what was coming, knowing it was coming, and he hadn't run. Caleb thought he understood something about that now, about how it was possible to be frightened all the way through and still not leave. He'd thought for 4 years that emptying himself out was survival. He'd thought that having nothing to protect meant nothing could break him. What he hadn't understood, what he was only starting to understand now, in a cold backyard in January, with a child leaning slightly against his arm, was that it also meant nothing could hold him. Nothing could make him stay. And staying, it turned out, choosing a place and a person and the willingness to be broken. If it came to that, staying was the thing he'd been missing when he thought he was protecting himself. He didn't say any of this. It wasn't the kind of thing you said out loud on a back step, but he sat with it, and it sat with him, and when Lily finally got up and said she was cold and went inside, he stayed a few minutes longer in the dark with it. They left for Millhaven before dawn. Clara came with them this time because she said she'd be damned if she sat home waiting, and because, as she pointed out, she had relevant things to say about what she'd witnessed at her own kitchen table with Sheriff Poole. Webb had included her as a potential witness, which she'd received with the same matter-of-fact quality she received most things. Lily rode in the buggy with Webb and Clara. Caleb rode beside them on his horse, whose leg had healed well enough over the weeks of rest that she moved without favoring it. He scanned the road the whole way. Nobody followed. Nobody appeared on any ridge. The landscape held its silence in the way of a thing that has made a decision and is waiting to see how it lands. They arrived in Millhaven by mid-morning. The courthouse was exactly as Caleb remembered it, stone and gravity, the slow institutional air of a place that moved in its own time regardless of urgency. Webb went inside to check on the status of the hearing. Caleb waited with Lily and Clara on the front steps. It was cold. Clara had brought blankets from the buggy, and she and Lily sat on the top step wrapped in one while Caleb stood and watched the street. And then he saw Garrett. The feed store man from Black Ridge Valley was walking down the main street of Millhaven in his good coat, looking uncomfortable and determined in equal measure, scanning the front of the courthouse until he found Caleb and stopped. They looked at each other across the distance. Garrett gave a single, stiff nod. Caleb nodded back. Mrs. Greer arrived 20 minutes later with a younger woman who turned out to be her niece who'd driven her because she couldn't manage the road alone at her age. Deke Sutton from the livery came on his own horse, arriving just after noon, and tied up at the post without looking at anyone until he'd collected himself, and then came up the steps and said, "Didn't think I'd make it, but here I am," to nobody in particular. Webb came back out, looked at the gathering on the steps, and said nothing for a moment. "Vass isn't here," Caleb said quietly. "No," Webb agreed. He looked down the street. "The hearing begins in 40 minutes. Cresswell is already inside." 40 minutes. Caleb looked at Lily, who was watching the people on the steps with a careful expression, cataloging each one with those eyes that forgot nothing. She looked at Garrett and seemed to recognize him, the feed store man she must have seen in town during her 15 days, and something moved briefly through her face. "These people came," she said quietly, to no one specific. "Yes," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Papa would have been surprised." "Maybe," Caleb said. "Or maybe he always thought people would come through if someone gave them the chance." She considered this. "He told me not to trust easily, but he also said most people aren't bad, they're just afraid." Webb was looking at his watch. "We should go in," he said. They went in. The courtroom was smaller than Caleb had imagined, a single room with wooden benches and a raised platform for the judge and a table on each side for opposing counsel. At the right table sat Cresswell, a tall man in an expensive suit with the careful, assembled look of someone who dressed to communicate authority, and beside him, which Caleb had not expected, sat Victor Hale himself. He'd seen Hale only once before, from a distance, the morning he'd walked past Lily on the steps. Up close, the man was less dramatic than the idea of him. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, with a face that had the closed quality of someone who had spent decades being right and had organized everything around maintaining that experience. He looked at Caleb when they entered, and the look was flat and appraising and entirely without the anger Caleb might have expected, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than anger would have been. They settled at their table. Webb arranged his papers. Lily sat between Webb and Clara with her hands folded in her lap. The judge came in, a man named Hartwell, gray and spare, with the expression of someone who had seen enough versions of this particular kind of dispute to have opinions about it that he was professionally obligated not to show. "This is the matter of Monroe versus Hale, territorial land claim proceeding, case number," he began, and the room went to that particular attentive quiet of a space where something is about to be decided. Caleb sat in the gallery behind the table, and he looked at the back of Lily's head, and he thought, "We got you here, Samuel. We got her here. Whatever happened in the next hours, whatever Cresswell said and Hale arranged and the judge decided, they'd gotten her here with the documents intact and witnesses who'd chosen to show up and a lawyer who knew what he was doing. That was what they could do. They'd done it." He straightened in his seat. And then the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and he turned and Roy Vass walked in. He looked like he'd ridden through the night. His coat was road dusty, and his face was tired in the specific way of someone who'd had a long private argument and arrived at an uncomfortable answer. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Caleb, and Caleb looked at him, and Vass said nothing, just walked to the gallery bench on their side and sat down. Webb saw him. A very small thing happened in Webb's expression, quickly controlled. Cresswell also saw him. Something happened in his expression too, less quickly controlled. And across the room, Victor Hale turned to look at what his lawyer was looking at, and for the first time since Caleb had entered the courtroom, something moved through that flat, closed face. Not fear, exactly. Not yet. But the recognition of something unexpected, something that hadn't been accounted for, something that meant the case he'd prepared was not entirely the case he was now facing. Judge Hartwell brought down his gavel. "We'll begin," he said. Cresswell opened for Hale with the confidence of a man who had prepared for a document case and still believed, despite Roy Vass sitting in the gallery, that he was in one. He was good. Caleb had to give him that. The man stood at the front of that small courtroom and built his argument the way a skilled carpenter builds a frame, piece by piece, each piece dependent on the last. the whole thing designed to look inevitable by the time he was done. His position was straightforward in its construction, if not in its honesty. The Monroe family claim was based on documents of uncertain provenance, filed under a defunct territorial designation by people who had never formally registered continuous residence in any verifiable legal record. Victor Hale's counterclaim, by contrast, was based on properly filed, properly witnessed, properly registered documentation submitted to the current territorial authority through every correct channel. Whatever sentimental weight one might attach to the Monroe family's history on this land, the law dealt in records, not sentiment. He said all of this smoothly and at moderate length and sat down. Webb stood up. He did not match Cresswell's smoothness. He was a small man in a coat that had seen better decades, and he spoke with the slightly irregular cadence of someone who was thinking while talking rather than reciting. And Caleb had come to understand over the past weeks that this was not a weakness. It was how Webb actually worked. He thought out loud, and the thinking was real, and judges who had spent careers listening to polished men recite prepared arguments sometimes responded to real thinking the way people respond to cold water on a hot day. He presented the three documents in sequence. The 1851 territorial filing first, the seal authenticated, the dates unambiguous, the name Elias Monroe entered in the territorial record as the original claimant on the spring property with continuous family residence documented from 1849. Then Samuel Monroe's 1871 letter, which Webb read sections of. Not the whole thing, just the key passages, the ones where Samuel detailed the history of the land in his own words, the improvements made, the family's presence there across 2 generations, his knowledge of Hale's increasing interest and his growing fear of what that interest might ultimately require of him. And then the formal transfer document, showing the unbroken line from grandfather to father to daughter. Judge Hartwell read each document himself before allowing it to be entered. He asked Webb 2 specific questions about the 1851 filing's designation and listened to the answers without expression. Cresswell objected 3 times during the document presentation. Hartwell sustained none of them. That was the first thing that shifted the feeling in the room. Then Webb called Garrett. The feed store man walked to the front of the courtroom with the look of someone doing something uncomfortable but decided, and he answered Webb's questions in a flat, careful voice that didn't editorialize and didn't flinch. He described Victor Hale's man watching Lily Monroe's position on the trading post steps. He described the same man reporting back to Hale's offices at regular intervals. He described the 15 days he personally witnessed this pattern while walking past those steps on his daily route. He described the conversation he'd had with Samuel Monroe 6 weeks before Monroe's death, in which Monroe had told him directly that he feared Hale was preparing to move against him, and that he had documentation securing his family's land claim. Cresswell's cross-examination was pointed. He went after Garrett's mortgage, establishing that Garrett owed money to a Hale-affiliated lending institution, and therefore had a financial interest in Hale's legal defeat. Garrett acknowledged the mortgage. He did not look away. He said, when Cresswell pressed the implication of bias, "I owe him money. I'm not going to lie about what I saw with my own eyes to keep owing it." Hartwell made a note. Mrs. Greer was next. She was nervous in a way that showed, her hands gripping her bag, her voice initially too quiet so that Hartwell asked her twice to speak up. But the content of what she said was specific and damaging in the precise way that nervous, specific witnesses sometimes are, because they sound exactly like what they are. People saying true things they wish they didn't have to say. She testified to seeing Hale's man stationed near the trading post each morning during the 15 days. She testified to leaving a roll on the step for Lily because she couldn't walk all the way past. She testified to doing so furtively, without stopping, because she was afraid of being seen helping the child by anyone connected to Hale's operation. Afraid of what specifically? Webb asked. Mrs. Greer was quiet for a moment. Afraid of what happens in this valley, she said, when you do something Victor Hale doesn't want you to do. Cresswell objected. Hartwell overruled. Deke Sutton testified to the surveillance pattern, corroborating Garrett and Mrs. Greer independently. His testimony was shorter and blunter. He'd seen what he'd seen, he said it, and he sat down. Then Webb called Roy Vass. The courtroom had a specific quality of attention for Vass that it hadn't had for the others. Cresswell sat very still at his table. Beside him, Victor Hale had the expression of a man doing careful arithmetic and not liking the results. Vass took the oath and sat and looked at Webb and waited. "Mr. Vass," Webb said, "you were employed by Victor Hale from what period to what period?" "January 1873 to August 1873. "And in what capacity?" "Rider, general work, whatever was needed." "Were you present in August 1873 for a conversation between Victor Hale and his foreman, a man named Dutch Calloway, regarding the death of Samuel Monroe?" A pause. Not hesitation. Vass had decided to be here, and having decided, he wasn't going to falter. It was more like he was making sure he was about to say exactly what was true, and nothing more or less than that. "Yes," he said. "Can you describe what was said in that conversation?" Cresswell was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay." "Mr. Webb," Hartwell said. "Statement of a party opponent, Your Honor. Victor Hale's own words are not hearsay when offered against him." Hartwell considered for 2 seconds. "Overruled. The witness will answer." Vass said, "Hale told Calloway that the Monroe problem had resolved itself. He used those words specifically, resolved itself. Calloway asked if there was anything that needed cleaning up out at the canyon. Hale said it had been handled already, and the sheriff had been spoken to, and it would go in the record as an accident." He paused. "I asked Calloway afterward what they were talking about. He told me Monroe had gone off the canyon edge, and that it wasn't something I needed to know more about." The room was very still. "And what did you do with that information at the time?" Webb asked. "Nothing," Vass said. He said it without looking away, which Caleb understood was the harder version. "I needed the work, and I told myself I didn't know for certain what had happened, and it wasn't my business." He paused. "I quit 2 weeks later, told myself that was enough." "Was it?" Webb asked quietly. Another pause. "No," Vass said. "It wasn't." Cresswell's cross-examination of Vass was aggressive in a way that revealed, Caleb thought, something about the state of Hale's confidence. The smoothness was gone. Cresswell attacked Vass's credibility, his reasons for leaving Hale's employ, the possibility that he held a personal grievance, the fact that the conversation he described had no other living witness willing to corroborate. Vass answered each challenge with the same flat, tired directness. He didn't have a grievance. He'd left because he was uncomfortable with what he'd heard. He understood there was no other witness. He was saying what he'd heard because a child's future was in front of a judge, and he knew something relevant. "You're asking this court to take the word of a single disgruntled former employee against a man of established standing in this territory," Cresswell said, with the tone of a closing point. "I'm saying what I heard," Vass said. "You can call it what you want." When it was time for Webb to call Caleb, Caleb walked to the front of the courtroom, aware of Hale watching him. He sat down and looked at Webb. "Mr. Hunter," Webb said, "can you describe the circumstances under which you first encountered Lily Monroe?" He told it. He told it the way it had actually happened, without cleaning it up, because Webb had told him in the buggy on the road to Millhaven that the most important thing he could do on that stand was be exactly as imperfect as he was. "Don't make yourself sound like a hero," Webb had said. "Hartwell has seen 100 men trying to sound like heroes. Tell him the truth, including the parts where you weren't sure and the parts where you almost walked away." So he told those parts. He told about almost not stopping. He told about walking away and standing at the end of the block having an argument with himself. He told about $42 and a horse with a bad leg and 4 years of specifically not being attached to anything. And he told about the moment he understood that Samuel Monroe's death had probably not been an accident, and that the town around him had understood this and had made a collective decision that understanding it was less dangerous than acting on it. Then Webb asked, "Mr. Hunter, why did you go back?" He'd known this question was coming. He'd thought about how to answer it for 2 days. "Because I'd done the other thing long enough," he said. "Walking past, not getting involved. I'd been doing it for 4 years and I was good at it, and it kept me safe, and it cost me something I didn't have a name for until I sat down on those steps next to a 7-year-old who was protecting her dead father's documents inside her coat." He paused. "I don't think I went back because I'm a particularly good man. I went back because I was standing at the end of that block and I could see her sitting there, and I couldn't make myself not see her, and I'd spent 4 years making myself not see things, and I was tired of it." Hartwell looked at him for a moment over his papers. Just a moment. Then he looked back down. Cresswell's cross-examination of Caleb was what Caleb had expected. The drifter angle, the lack of legal standing, the suggestion that he had manufactured or coached the witnesses, the question of what a man with no roots and no stake in this valley had to gain from inserting himself into a land dispute. Caleb answered everything directly. He didn't have legal standing. He had no formal relationship with Lily Monroe. He had nothing to gain financially. He had coached nobody. Webb had prepared people for the procedural aspects of testimony, which was standard practice, but the content of what each witness said was their own. "So you ask this court to believe," Cresswell said, "that a complete stranger rode into town, decided within days to take up the cause of an unknown child against one of the most established landowners in this territory, traveled 40 miles to hire a lawyer, filed documents in territorial court, assembled witnesses, and appeared here today, all purely from the goodness of his heart, with nothing to gain?" Caleb looked at him. "I asked this court to look at the documents," he said. "My motives don't change what the dates say." Hartwell made another note. Then Webb did something that Cresswell had clearly not prepared for. He asked to call Victor Hale. Hale took the stand with the bearing of a man who had decided that being unrattled was his best protection. He answered Webb's early questions in a measured, controlled way. The history of his land acquisition, the legitimacy of his filing, the characterization of his interest in the Monroe property as straightforward commerce rather than anything more complicated. Then Webb said, "Mr. Hale, you were aware that Lily Monroe was sitting on the steps of the abandoned trading post on Main Street in Black Ridge Valley for 15 days in January of this year?" "I was aware there was a child there, yes." "You walked past her personally on at least 4 occasions during those 15 days. This has been testified to by 2 witnesses, and you have not disputed it. Did you attempt to provide her with food, shelter, or any form of assistance during those 15 days? A pause. "That was a matter for the sheriff's office to address." "Did you contact the sheriff's office to bring the matter to their attention?" A longer pause. "I assumed others had done so." "You assumed," Webb said. He let the words sit there. A child was sitting in the cold on a public street for 15 days, and you, the man who, by the testimony of multiple witnesses, had stationed men to watch her position, assumed others were handling it. "Objection," Cresswell said. "Counsel is characterizing." "Withdrawn," Webb said. "Mr. Hale, did you at any point during those 15 days take any action whatsoever to ensure the welfare of Lily Monroe?" Hale looked at Webb. "No," he said. "Thank you," Webb said. "No further questions." The silence that followed was of a particular texture. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody gasped, nobody moved. It was just very quiet in a way that had weight in it, the weight of a simple true answer to a simple true question that had no good follow-up. Cresswell did not rehabilitate it well on redirect. There wasn't much to rehabilitate. Webb's closing was short. He summarized the documentary evidence, the chain of family claim, the dates that could not be argued with. He summarized the pattern of surveillance that multiple independent witnesses had described. He noted Vass's testimony about the conversation following Samuel Monroe's death, and he noted what that testimony implied without overstating it, because overstating it would give Cresswell something to push back against, and the implication spoke clearly enough on its own. He ended by saying, without raising his voice, "Your Honor, this child's grandfather came to this valley before most anyone. He built something. His son inherited it and spent his life protecting it and died by substantial evidence because the wrong man wanted it. The documents are genuine, the dates are unambiguous, and the law is clear. We ask the court to see this for what it is." Cresswell's closing was longer and more elaborate and worked very hard to restore the frame he'd built at the opening, the one about documentation and proper process, and the court dealing in records rather than sentiment. He was good at it. But there was something slightly off in the rhythm of it, a quality of a man reassembling an argument that had taken damage during the proceedings. And Caleb thought that even the parts that were technically effective didn't have the same weight they'd have had in the morning, before Hale's own answer to that last question. Hartwell recessed to consider. They waited in the corridor outside the courtroom for an hour and 40 minutes. Clara had brought food from the buggy, biscuits and dried meat. And they ate standing up because sitting felt wrong, felt like settling into the weight in a way that might change the outcome by the angle of their hope. That was irrational, and Caleb knew it was irrational, and he stood against the wall and ate a biscuit anyway. Lily stood near the window at the end of the corridor. She wasn't eating. She was looking out at the street below with that quality of stillness she had, the kind that wasn't emptiness, but was more like a full thing held very carefully. Caleb went and stood beside her. "What are you looking at?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He looked with her. The street below was an ordinary street, February mud and horse traffic, and the unhurried motion of a town conducting its afternoon. Nothing about it knew or cared what was happening in the building above it. "Whatever Hartwell decides," Lily said, "it's not going to bring Papa back." "No," Caleb said, "it's not." "I know that." She said it without self-pity, just as a statement of something she'd already completed her accounting on. "I know the land isn't the same as him, but he worked for it for so long. He was scared for so long." She paused. "I want it to have mattered." Caleb didn't say it will matter, because he didn't know that yet. He didn't say your father's watching, because he didn't traffic in that kind of comfort. He said, "The people in that courtroom stood up, Garrett and Mrs. Greer and Sutton and Vass. They were afraid, and they came anyway. That already happened. Whatever Hartwell decides, that already happened." She thought about this. "Because you asked them to." "Because they decided to," he said. "I just knocked on some doors." She looked at him sideways. "You're not very good at taking credit for things." "I'm trying to be accurate." "Papa was like that too," she said, quietly, with a small thing that might have been almost a smile, the first he'd seen from her in a long time, fragile and real and gone again quickly. The bailiff came to the corridor door. They went back in. Judge Hartwell settled himself behind the bench with the unhurried quality of a man who had made his decision and was not anxious about it. He looked at his papers. He looked at the room. "This court has reviewed the documentary evidence submitted by the Monroe party," he said, "and finds it to be genuine, properly authenticated, and legally significant. The prior claim filing of June 1851 under Elias Monroe establishes a family land claim that predates the counterclaim filed by Victor Hale by a minimum of 6 years. Under territorial law, a prior and continuous family claim of this nature supersedes a subsequent commercial filing where continuous residence and improvement can be demonstrated." He paused. "The testimony and supplementary documentation presented by the Monroe party demonstrates continuous residence and improvement to this court's satisfaction." Cresswell's pen was still. "With respect to the counterclaim filed by Victor Hale," Hartwell continued, "this court finds it to be without legal foundation given the prior claim. The counterclaim is hereby dismissed." He looked up. "The spring property and all associated water rights as described in the original Monroe family filing are the legal inheritance of Lily Monroe, minor, and shall be held in trust for her until her majority, administered by a court-appointed trustee." He looked at Webb. "Counsel, I'll want your recommendation on trustee appointment within 2 weeks." "Yes, Your Honor," Webb said. Hartwell looked at the room once more. "There are additional matters arising from the testimony in this proceeding that this court refers to the Territorial Sheriff's Office for investigation. Those matters are outside the scope of this hearing, but have been noted in the court record." He looked for just a moment at Victor Hale. "Court is adjourned." The gavel. The room exhaled. Not loudly. Nobody cheered or wept or did any of the things that happen in stories where everything resolves in a single clean moment. Garrett let out a long breath. Mrs. Greer's hand went to her mouth briefly. Deke Sutton looked at the floor with an expression of private relief. Roy Vass sat without moving, looking at nothing in particular, with the look of a man who had done something he couldn't take back and was deciding whether he was glad. Across the room, Cresswell was speaking quietly to Hale. Hale's face had the closed, still quality of a man absorbing something in private before deciding what to do about it in public. He stood when Cresswell stood, and he walked out of the courtroom without looking at the Monroe table, and Caleb watched him go and thought, this isn't finished for him. Men like that don't finish easily. But the shape of the problem had changed. The land was in the court record now, Lily's inheritance documented and sealed, and Hale would understand that fighting it further would cost him more than it gained him. The referral to the territorial sheriff was a different matter, that one would take longer and arrive at its own pace. But it was in the record, and men like Victor Hale lived and died by records. Lily sat at the table beside Webb and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she turned to Webb and said, "Did we win?" Webb looked at her over his spectacles. "Yes," he said. "You won." She nodded slowly, like she was filing it in the right place internally. Then she picked up her coat from the back of the chair and held the leather pouch for a moment in both hands and put it back in her pocket, and she stood up. She went and found Roy Vass before he got to the door. Caleb watched from a distance. He couldn't hear what she said. Vass crouched down to her level, same as Caleb had done on those steps, he noticed, and listened, and something moved through the man's tired face, something complicated that looked like it had been a long time building and had finally found a direction to go. He said something back to her. She nodded. She let him leave first. Then she came back to where Caleb was standing and said, "I thanked him." "Good," Caleb said. "He said he was sorry he didn't say something sooner." "People usually are." She looked up at him. "Are you? Sorry about anything sooner?" He thought about 4 years of empty roads. He thought about standing at the end of a block having a losing argument with himself. He thought about all the other blocks, in all the other towns where the argument had gone the other way. Yeah, he said, "a few things." "Me too," she said, though she was 7 years old and had survived more than most people twice her age, and he thought that whatever she was sorry for was probably not something she needed to carry. "You did everything right," he said, "everything your papa asked." She looked at the floor for a moment, then, "Can we go home now?" The word landed the way it landed, and he felt it, and he did not make a thing of it. He just said, "Yeah, let's go home." The road back to Clara's was different from every road that had come before it, though it was the same frozen mud and gray sky and the same country that had been holding its cold silence for months. The difference was internal, the quality of sitting in a thing that had been decided, that was over in its essential contest, even if the edges would continue to resolve themselves for weeks and months ahead. Webb rode with them and was quiet in his particular way, reviewing something in his head, or maybe just resting. Clara drove the buggy with Lily beside her, and at some point Lily fell asleep against Clara's arm, and Clara drove the last hour without moving so as not to wake her. In the following weeks, things happened at their own pace. The court-appointed trustee turned out to be Aldous Webb himself, which Hartwell had suggested and nobody objected to, and which meant the Monroe Spring property had competent legal management for the years, until Lily turned 18. Webb came back to Black Ridge Valley twice to handle the practical transfer of documentation and the formal recording of Lily's claim with the local land registry, a registry that had previously contained only Hale's paperwork on the property and that now contained something that superseded it. Sheriff Poole resigned his office in March. The timing was its own kind of statement. The man who replaced him was a deputy from the county seat who had no particular relationship with Victor Hale and who seemed, in the early days at least, to be interested in simply doing the job without side arrangements. Whether that would last was a thing that only time would tell. The territorial sheriff's investigation into Samuel Monroe's death moved slowly, as such things did, but it moved. Roy Vass gave a formal statement that took 2 hours and covered everything he knew in the careful, specific way he'd testified in the courtroom. Dutch Calloway, Hale's foreman, declined to speak to investigators. Hale's lawyer issued several documents asserting his client's complete cooperation, while simultaneously preventing that cooperation from occurring in any meaningful way. It was a process that would take longer than anyone wanted, with an outcome that couldn't be guaranteed, and Caleb understood that this was the way of things. That justice, when it came imperfectly and slowly, and sometimes arrived at a place that didn't look exactly like what you'd hoped for. But it moved. It moved because there was a record now, and Roy Vass's name in it, and the court referral that Hartwell had put there in 2 sentences that cost him almost nothing to write, and meant a great deal to the shape of what came next. Victor Hale did not disappear from Black Ridge Valley. He had too much there to simply go. But the quality of his presence changed in ways that were hard to quantify and easy to feel. The mortgages he held didn't evaporate, but the leverage they represented depended on a kind of certainty that had been quietly compromised. Garrett kept his store. Mrs. Greer kept her dressmaking operation. Deke Sutton kept the livery. They had done the thing that scared them, and they were still standing, and while they had not suddenly become bold people, they were who they were, and fear is not cured by a single courthouse morning. They had done something that couldn't be undone, and that was its own kind of ground to stand on. Clara, who had been renting her ranch land on an annual arrangement that Hale had technically owned a stake in through a complicated third-party agreement Webb uncovered, found that particular arrangement quietly dissolved in April, replaced by a direct title that put the land in her name. Webb had found the angle in the paperwork. She received this news in the kitchen where she'd been doing things in kitchens all her life, and she said nothing about it for a moment. And then she said, "Took long enough," and put the kettle on. The spring property sat empty through that first summer. Caleb worked it. He hadn't planned to, not exactly. He'd planned to stay through the hearing and see what happened and then figure out the next thing, which was the plan he'd been running on for 4 years. But after the hearing, the next thing kept not appearing in any form that required him to go toward it, and there was work at Clara's that needed doing, and work at the Monroe property that more than needed doing, and he found himself driving out there in the mornings and spending his days clearing the land around the spring, repairing the fence lines that had been neglected for 2 years, pulling down the structure that Samuel Monroe had built before he died, and building the beginning of something new in its place. I was not a carpenter. He made that clear to himself and to anyone who asked, and a few people did ask because the work was visible from the road. He was a man with tools and a reasonably clear picture of what a house needed to be to keep out wind and rain, and he applied himself to the project with the thoroughness that scared people sometimes generated, which meant he went slowly and he checked everything twice, and when he got something wrong, he took it apart and did it again. Lily came out on Saturdays. That was the arrangement he had with Clara, who was nominally looking after her in the formal sense during the period when Webb was arranging the legal details of her custody and living situation, a process that was considerably less dramatic than the rest of what had happened, but took its own time. On Saturdays, Clara drove her out in the buggy, and she watched Caleb work and sometimes helped with the parts that didn't require size or strength, and they talked or didn't talk in roughly equal measure. She had started going to the school in Black Ridge Valley in March. The teacher was a young woman from Ohio who had heard about Lily's situation through the particular information channels of a small town, and who treated her with exactly the same combination of firm expectation and practical kindness that she applied to all her students, which was exactly the right thing. Lily came home on school days with homework and opinions about long division and occasional reports about things that had happened between children in the way things happened, with the complexity and unfairness that adults spent their lives either forgetting or over-romanticizing. She was, imperfectly and slowly, and in the way of children who have been through things, starting to be a child again. By August, the house had walls and a roof and 2 windows on the south side that caught the afternoon light, and a porch that was narrow but real, and a door that hung straight in its frame, which Caleb was perhaps more satisfied about than was warranted. He was sitting on the porch steps in the early evening, eating something Clara had sent with Lily on her last visit, when the question he'd been not quite asking himself for months finally arrived in a form he couldn't avoid. I was going to stay, or he was going to go. Those were the options. They'd been the options for a while, technically, but until the house had walls, the staying had felt like a practical decision rather than a real one. Now the house had walls. Now the decision was what it actually was. He sat with it the way he'd sat with difficult things on Clara's back step in January, not trying to solve it quickly, just looking at it directly. He thought about 4 years of roads. He thought about Margaret and Thomas and what he'd done with the loss of them, which was to make himself into someone who couldn't lose anything more because he'd stopped having anything to lose. He thought that was survival. He understood now that it was something smaller and colder than survival. It was just absence. He'd made himself absent from his own life because the alternative was to feel the size of what was missing. He thought about Lily's question on the back step. "Do you still remember their voices?" And his answer, "Some of it, not all of it, but some." He thought about what he'd said afterward. "You keep it in other ways, in what he taught you, the things you do because he showed you how." He thought about a 7-year-old girl sewing documents into coat linings because her father had taught her that scared makes you thorough. He thought about the 15 notches in the back of the bottom step, one for each day, kept in secret because saying the number out loud to a stranger would make it real, in a way it hadn't been yet. He thought about the leather pouch pressed flat against her chest like a second heartbeat, carrying it through a courthouse and a kitchen standoff, and a judge's ruling and every road in between. She was thorough because she'd been scared. She was still here because Samuel Monroe had loved her in the most practical way available to him, not by protecting her from everything, which was impossible, but by giving her the tools to protect herself. What Caleb had spent 4 years calling survival had actually been something else. It had been refusing to be scared anymore by the simple method of refusing to have anything worth losing. That wasn't the same thing as strength. He understood that now with a clarity that had the particular ache of something that's been true for a while and is only just being admitted. He heard the buggy before he saw it. Lily was sitting beside Clara on the seat, which was where she usually sat on the Saturday drives. And when Clara pulled up at the edge of the property, Lily climbed down before the horse had fully stopped, which she did every week, and which Clara disapproved of every week in a mild ongoing way that neither of them expected to resolve. She came across the property with the half-running walk she had when she was coming from a distance and didn't want to look like she was running, and she stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the house the way she always looked at it, assessing the changes since last week, cataloging what was new. "You finished the porch," she said. "Last Tuesday." She came up the 2 steps and stood on it, testing it the way you test new things, shifting her weight. It held. She looked at the south-facing windows, at the way the evening light came through. "It's good," she said. "It's not finished inside yet," he said. "Floor in the second room still needs work." "Which room is the second room?" He looked at her. She was looking at the door, not at him, with a careful quality of attention that he recognized as Lily not asking something she wanted to ask. "The smaller one," he said, "on the east side." A pause. "What's it going to be used for?" He looked at the valley, at the evening light going long and gold across the land that had been her grandfather's and her father's and was now hers in the legal record of a territorial court, held in trust until she was old enough to hold it herself. He'd made a decision some weeks ago, somewhere in the middle of the building, without marking the exact moment it happened. That was how real decisions sometimes arrived. Not as announcements, but as things you discovered had already been made when you weren't paying close attention to anything but the work in front of you. "Whatever you need it to be," he said. She looked at him then, full and direct, the way she looked at things she was deciding to trust. "Clara thinks you're going to stay," she said. "What do you think?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. "I think you're building a house with 2 rooms," she said, "and you're not a man who builds more than he needs." He thought about that. He thought it was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said about him in years. "No," he said, "I'm not." She sat down on the porch step beside him, in the way she'd sat beside him on Clara's back step in January, and they looked at the valley together in the evening light. The spring was visible from here, the actual water catching the last of the sun in the way water does when everything else is going quiet, a small brightness at the edge of things. Her father had died for this water. Her grandfather had built his life around it. She would grow up beside it, and someday she would be old enough to hold the deed herself and decide what she wanted to do with what she'd inherited. That day was years away still, but it existed now in a way it hadn't existed 6 months ago, and that was something. "I miss him most in the evenings," she said. Not as a complaint, just as a true thing she was saying out loud because it was there, and he was someone she could say it to. "That makes sense," he said. "Does it get smaller, the missing?" He thought about the honest answer. "It gets different," he said. "It doesn't get smaller, but you get bigger around it, kind of. It takes up the same space, but you have more space. Eventually." She thought about this for a while. "That's not a very cheerful thing to say." "No," he agreed. "But you asked for the truth." She did the thing that was almost a smile again, the small, fragile one. "Papa would have liked you," she said. "He didn't like men who were smooth." "I've never been accused of being smooth," Caleb said. She leaned slightly against his arm the way she had on the winter step, and he sat still, and the valley held its evening quiet around them. The spring catching the last light, the land running out to the ridgeline, the sky going from gold to the deep particular blue of a frontier evening that has nowhere else to be. This was the thing that nobody told you about choosing to stay. Not the drama of it, not the courthouse and the documents and the hired men on ridges and the paper in the barn with its $1,200. Those were the events that forced the choice into the open. But the choice itself, the real one, happened here. In the ordinary evening. In the weight of someone sitting beside you, in the comfortable, familiar way of people who have gotten used to each other's presence. In the second room with its unfinished floor and its east-facing window, waiting to become what it needed to be. Caleb Hunter had come to Black Ridge Valley with $42 and no plan and a rule about not getting involved in complicated things. He'd broken the rule completely and spent most of the money and gotten involved in the most complicated thing available. He did not regret any of it. He thought about Margaret. He thought about Thomas. He held them in the way he'd described to Lily. Not all of it, but some of it, the parts that mattered, carried forward in the only direction available. He thought about a man named Samuel Monroe, who had been afraid for a long time and thorough because of it, and who had died before he got to see what his fear and his thoroughness had built. He thought about what it meant to stay. Not as a sacrifice, not as a noble thing, just as a practical human decision that some people made and some people didn't. And the difference between the two kinds of people was not always what you thought it was. Sometimes it was simply whether someone, at the right moment, on the right set of steps, had a biscuit to offer and was too tired of walking to walk away. The evening settled. Lily didn't say anything more, and neither did he, and the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling, that has its own texture and weight and warmth, the kind you only get between people who have been through something together and have arrived somewhere on the other side of it. A family is not always what you're born into. Sometimes it's what gets built in the space between a child who needed someone to stay and a man who finally, after 4 years of leaving, understood that staying was the bravest thing he had left. The spring caught the last of the light. The valley went quiet. They stayed.